My son's business partner was standing in the exact center of my study, and he wasn't looking at the books. I noticed it the moment I walked in to retrieve my reading glasses. Daniel and Marcus were supposed to be in the living room with the others, waiting for dinner. But Marcus had found his way to my study, and his eyes were moving slowly across the room, not the way a curious guest looks at a stranger's space, admiring the framed photographs or the old clock on the mantel. He was looking the way a man looks at something he already considers his, measuring, calculating. His gaze landed on the mahogany cabinet in the corner, the one where I keep the documents I haven't digitized, and it stayed there a beat too long before he turned and saw me in the doorway. "Richard," he said, smiling without hesitation. "Daniel told me you had a collection of first editions. I hope you don't mind." I told him I didn't mind at all. I lead. That was a Saturday in early October, 3 weeks before my son's 45th birthday celebration. A dinner that Marcus had, with great enthusiasm, suggested we hold at my house rather than a restaurant. "More personal," he'd said, when Daniel mentioned it on the phone. "Your father's home has so much history. It would mean a lot to Daniel, I think." I'd agreed before Daniel could say a word either way. I noticed my son had gone quiet on the call, but I told myself it was the connection. I had been telling myself a lot of things that autumn. Daniel is my only child. His mother, Patricia, passed 6 years ago, and in the years since, the distance between my son and me had grown in the quiet, unannounced way that distances do not from any single argument or wound, but from the accumulation of unreturned calls, of conversations that stayed on the surface, of two people who had both lost the same woman and didn't know how to talk about it. Daniel had thrown himself into his work, building a commercial real estate consulting firm from a 2-person operation into something with 20 employees and contracts across 4 states. I had been proud of him. I had told him so, I thought. But looking back now, I wonder if I told him in the way fathers tell sons factually, like citing evidence, rather than the way a man tells someone he loves. Marcus Webb had entered Daniel's life about 2 years before that October. He came in as a senior partner, someone Daniel had met at a conference in Atlanta, someone with connections and capital and the particular kind of confidence that fills a room before it earns the right to. Daniel spoke about him the way he used to speak about baseball players when he was 12, with admiration that had a slightly worrying edge of awe. Marcus this, Marcus that. Marcus says the Chicago deal is almost locked. Marcus has a contact who can cut the timeline in half. I am 63 years old. I spent 21 years as a federal prosecutor before I retired, and before that I spent 4 years in the Army. And before that I grew up in a house where my father taught me, with great patience and occasional severity, that the world contains 2 kinds of charming men. Those whose charm reflects something real underneath, and those whose charm is the whole structure, top to bottom, with nothing behind the walls. You learn to tell the difference by watching what a man looks at when he thinks no one is looking. Marcus Webb, standing in my study on that October Saturday, had been looking at my cabinet. I said nothing about it that evening. I served dinner, I poured wine, I listened to Marcus describe 3 different investment opportunities with the fluency of a man who had described them many times before to many different audiences. He was good. He was very good. He laughed at the right moments and listened with what appeared to be genuine attention and called me "sir" in a way that managed to sound respectful and slightly condescending at the same time. Daniel watched him the way an apprentice watches a master, and I watched Daniel. And somewhere between the salad course and the entree, I felt a cold, specific fear settle into my chest. Not fear for myself. I want to be clear about that. Fear for my son. Daniel had his mother's quality of trust. Patricia was the most intelligent person I have ever known. But she had this particular openness, a willingness to believe in people that was neither naive nor careless, but simply generous, a choice she made deliberately and daily. And it was one of the things I had loved most about her. Daniel inherited it in full. In his line of work, it had served him well, because people felt it and responded to it and wanted to deserve it. But it also meant that when someone decided to exploit that trust, Daniel often didn't see it until the damage was considerable. Patricia had always been the one who caught those moments early. She would touch Daniel's arm at dinner and say something quiet, and that would be enough. I had never learned to do it the way she did. My versions of warning had always come out as interrogations, and Daniel had, not unreasonably, learned to deflect them. So I said nothing that evening either. After dinner, Marcus excused himself to make a phone call, and for about 4 minutes I sat alone with my son in the kitchen while he helped me wrap the leftover bread. He seemed relaxed, lighter than he'd been in months, talking about the birthday dinner coming up and how he wanted it to be simple, just family and a few close friends. I started to ask about Marcus, something careful, something that would open a door without forcing it, and then Marcus came back into the kitchen, smiling about his call, and the moment closed. I watched my son's face when Marcus walked in. Daniel smiled, and it was a real smile. Whatever Marcus was, Daniel believed in him. That made the whole thing considerably more complicated. The next morning, after they'd both gone, I went into my study and opened the mahogany cabinet. What I found confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. Among the documents in that cabinet, I keep records relating to a trust my father established in 1987, updated twice since then, along with the deed to this house, certain financial instruments, and the documentation for a piece of commercial property in Western Virginia that my father purchased before I was born, and that has sat, largely dormant, for decades. It is not glamorous. It is approximately 40 acres of land that my father believed would one day be worth developing. And for 40 years, nothing much happened. And then 3 years ago, a regional infrastructure project brought a highway interchange within 6 miles of it, and its assessed value increased by a factor that would have made my father laugh out loud. I had not spoken about this publicly. My attorney knew. My accountant knew. Daniel knew. In general terms. Somehow Marcus Webb also seemed to know. Because 2 of the documents in that cabinet had been moved. Not removed, moved. Returned to slightly wrong positions, a 1/4 inch off where I always keep them. The kind of displacement that only registers if you have a prosecutor's habit of noticing where things are. I sat with that information for several days. I did not tell Daniel, not yet. I needed to understand the shape of it first, and I needed to do it without tipping my hand, because if Marcus was as careful as he appeared, any early warning would only teach him to be more careful. I am not a man who acts on suspicion alone. I spent 2 decades building cases, and I knew better than anyone that the space between suspicion and evidence is the space where everything either holds together or falls apart. I made 3 phone calls over the following week. The first was to a former colleague who now runs a private investigations firm in Washington. The second was to my attorney. The third was to a woman I had prosecuted in 1998 white-collar fraud. She'd taken a plea and served 2 years, who had since rebuilt her life entirely, and now ran financial compliance consulting, and who owed me nothing but picked up on the second ring when I gave my name because she said I was one of the only prosecutors who had treated her with basic human dignity through the process. I mention her because what she found in 4 days would have taken me 4 months. Marcus Webb had a pattern. Not a criminal record, he was too careful for that, but a pattern. 2 previous business partnerships in the preceding decade, both with men in their mid to late 40s who had successful careers and aging, asset-rich parents. In both cases, Marcus had maneuvered himself into a position of financial overlap with the family, introduced documents for review, cultivated a relationship with the older generation, friendly, respectful, the attentive, almost son-in-law, and in both cases the partnerships had ended in quiet, private settlements after financial irregularities were discovered. No charges, no headlines. The families had wanted it quiet. They'd paid to make it quiet. Marcus was counting on the same outcome here. I want to tell you that when I read my colleague's report, I felt righteous anger, the clean, hot kind that moves you immediately to action. But that's not what I felt. What I felt was something colder and more complicated, because the person I was most worried about in all of it was my son. Daniel had built something real. He had worked genuinely hard for years, with genuine skill, and somewhere along the way, he had let Marcus Webb inside that work, inside his company's finances, possibly inside the trust documentation he'd shown me last spring when we discussed updating my estate plan. If this unraveled badly, Daniel wasn't just going to lose money. He was going to have to reckon with the fact that his own judgment had made it possible, and that his father had seen it before he had. I know what that kind of reckoning does to a man. It has nothing to do with money. I called my attorney again. We spent 3 hours on the phone over 2 evenings, and by the end I had a plan. It was not complicated. The best plans rarely are. It required patience, a specific document, and my son's birthday dinner. I prepared for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, I watched. Marcus texted me twice warm, casual messages, once about a football game, once about a restaurant he thought I might enjoy near my neighborhood. Exactly the right frequency, exactly the right temperature. I replied to both with the same warmth. I watched Daniel on our Sunday phone calls. He sounded well, busy, optimistic about a new contract, mentioning Marcus less than he usually did, which I noted without comment. On the Thursday before the dinner, Daniel called in the early evening, and I could tell within the first minute that something had shifted. His voice had a quality I recognized from when he was a teenager, a kind of careful steadiness that meant something was wrong, and he was deciding whether to say so. We talked about the birthday dinner logistics, about the guest list, about whether I had enough chairs. I waited. He didn't say it. We ended the call, and I sat in the kitchen for a long time thinking about my wife. Patricia would have found a way. She would have said something simple and true that opened the door without making Daniel feel interrogated. I had never been able to do that. Everything I'd learned about conversation, I'd learned in courtrooms and interrogation rooms, and those were not the right tools for a father talking to his son. It was perhaps the thing about myself I had worked hardest to accept in the 6 years since she died, and I was still working on it. The birthday dinner was on a Saturday. There were 11 people at the table. Daniel's 2 closest friends from college, both of whom I had watched grow up in this house, and who called me by my first name without it ever feeling presumptuous. Daniel's office manager, a steady and unflappable woman named Diane, who had been with him since the beginning, and whom I had always trusted the moment I met her. 2 couples from the neighborhood whom Daniel had stayed close to after his mother's death because they'd been Patricia's friends first, and he wanted to keep that connection. And Marcus, who arrived last. As I'd noticed, he always preferred to do never early enough to help, never late enough to apologize for, just precisely timed to make an entrance. He brought an expensive bottle of wine and a leather-bound planner embossed with Daniel's initials. I thanked him. I took his coat. I offered him a seat in the living room while I finished in the kitchen. Dinner went well, the way these things do when the food is good and the people around the table have genuine affection for each other. I watched Marcus work the table. He was charming with Daniel's college friends, deferential with the older couples, professionally warm with Diane, who I noticed gave him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I filed that away. About halfway through the main course, Marcus raised his glass and gave a brief toast to Daniel that was, I will admit, well constructed, specific enough to feel personal, general enough to flatter, ending on a note about the company's future that drew a round of applause and made Daniel look briefly, genuinely moved. I applauded with everyone else. I watched Marcus watch Daniel during the applause. That was when I understood the full scope of it. Marcus didn't dislike my son. He wasn't indifferent to him. He had simply decided that Daniel's affection was an asset to be managed, the same way he'd decided my land in Virginia was an asset to be acquired. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something in some ways worse, the complete absence of any consideration of Daniel as a person with interior weight. My son, whom Patricia and I had raised and worried over and loved without limit, was a variable in Marcus Webb's calculation. I excused myself after the main course to bring out the dessert. The kitchen was quiet. I had just set the cake on the counter when I heard footsteps, and I turned, expecting Daniel. And it was Daniel, but not for the reason I'd expected. He came through the kitchen door and closed it behind him, and he stood there for a moment looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in years, not since Patricia's diagnosis, when he'd driven 3 hours in the middle of a workday and walked in the front door, and I'd known from his face alone before he said anything that he'd been crying in the car. He crossed the kitchen and he pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. Then he said, quietly, "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know how to tell you." I opened the note. His handwriting, I hadn't seen his handwriting in years. Everything is text now. and I had forgotten that he still makes his capital letters the way Patricia taught him, slightly looped at the top. It said, "He's been using me to get to you. I just found out. I'm so sorry, Dad. Please help me fix this." I stood in my kitchen holding my son's note, and for a moment I couldn't speak. Not because of Marcus. Because of the last 3 words. Please help me. Daniel had not asked me for help, and I could not count how many years. He'd learned not to, because I'd made it complicated. Because my help always came packaged with analysis, an unsolicited assessment, and the prosecutorial habit of establishing what went wrong before offering any comfort. He had stopped bringing me things that required comfort. He had learned to bring me only the things he'd already handled. He had come to me before he'd handled this one. I put the note in my shirt pocket. I put my hand on my son's shoulder. "I know," I said. "I've known for 3 weeks." He stared at me. "There's a folder in the mahogany cabinet," I said. "3rd shelf. Get it and bring it to the living room. I'll handle the rest." He started to say something. I could see questions forming, and confusion, and something else underneath that I didn't have a name for right then, and I said, "We're going to talk about all of it. I promise. But first, I need you to get the folder." And Daniel, he stopped in the doorway. "I'm glad you came to me." He went. I carried the cake into the dining room, and I set it on the sideboard, and I turned to the table, and I said Marcus's name. He looked up. His expression was exactly what you'd expect, polite, engaged, the attentive guest. "I wonder if I could ask you to step into the study for a moment," I said. "There are some documents I'd like your opinion on. Real estate matter. Won't take long." He came willingly. Of course he did. He'd been waiting for this invitation. What I want to explain, and what I think people who haven't spent time in law sometimes misunderstand, is that exposing a man like Marcus is not actually a dramatic process. It doesn't require raised voices or a sudden revelation that causes him to crumble. A man like Marcus has a prepared response for every confrontation. He has practiced the look of wounded confusion, the measured denial, the graceful pivot toward generosity. Surely there's been a misunderstanding. Let's be reasonable. I value this relationship far too much. He has used those responses before. They work on most people. They work on people who need him to be innocent. I had stopped needing that about 3 weeks ago. I sat down behind my desk. Daniel came in a moment later with the folder and stood by the bookcase. I watched Marcus clock the folder, clock Daniel's presence, and make the rapid internal adjustment. This is not a casual consultation. Something has changed. "Marcus," I said, "I'm going to tell you what I know, and then I'm going to tell you what I'd like you to do, and then you're going to have a decision to make." I laid it out for him without theater. The moved documents, in October, my colleague's investigation, the 2 previous partnerships, the names of the families, the settlement figures I had obtained, the timeline that showed a clear and practiced sequence. The 3 specific instances in which Marcus had accessed Daniel's company documents that contained references to my estate planning, instances that Diane, Daniel's office manager, the woman with the smile that hadn't reached her eyes, had logged without saying anything for 8 weeks before finally coming to Daniel 4 days ago. The draft of a document that my attorney had received, forwarded anonymously from an account that took my colleague 6 days to trace back to an IP address associated with Marcus Webb's home network, a document that purported to initiate a voluntary transfer of the Virginia property into a holding company that Daniel and Marcus nominally co-owned, but that, under the operating agreement Marcus had drafted, would have given Marcus sole liquidation authority within 18 months. I set the folder on the desk. I had not raised my voice once. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The wounded confusion came first, right on schedule, and then the measured pivot. "Richard, I think there are some very significant misunderstandings here, and I want to address them directly, because I have enormous respect for you and for Daniel, and the last thing I would ever want is Marcus." I said his name the way I used to say names in closing arguments. Not loud, just final. I spent 21 years as a federal prosecutor. I tried 47 fraud cases. I am not presenting you with misunderstandings. I am presenting you with evidence. The room went quiet in a different way. "What I'd like you to do," I continued, "is sign the withdrawal of partnership agreement that my attorney has prepared. It dissolves your stake in Daniel's company, returns the contributed capital, and includes a mutual non-disparagement clause that benefits you considerably more than it benefits us. It is a better outcome than the alternative, which involves those documents going to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District, along with my colleague's full report and a letter from the two families who reached prior settlements and who, I should mention, are no longer interested in staying quiet. I paused. I spoke with both of them last week, I said. They've been waiting. Marcus looked at the folder. He looked at Daniel, who had said nothing during the entire exchange, who was standing by the bookcase with his hands loose at his sides, and an expression on his face that I recognized as the expression Patricia used to wear when she was trying very hard to hold herself steady. Then Marcus looked at me. The charm was gone. Not the face. The face was still composed, still professional, still the face of a man who understood how rooms work. But the warmth behind it had simply switched off, the way a light turns off when you leave a room. And what remained was something flat and careful and very cold. "How much time do I have to decide?" he said. "You're sitting in it," I said. He decided then. The calculation took approximately 4 seconds. I counted, and I watched him weigh the costs and benefits with the same efficiency he'd applied to my filing cabinet. And I watched him conclude, correctly, that his exposed position was untenable. He was good at the calculation. It was, I thought, the only thing about him that was real. He signed the agreement. My attorney had prepared it for signature without a notary. Daniel had the notarized version, arriving Monday. I had made certain the Monday version was the binding one, and that tonight's signature was simply, as I told Marcus with complete accuracy, a statement of intent. I showed Marcus to the door myself. I took his coat from the closet and held it out, and he put it on, and I opened the front door, and the October air came in, cold and clean. "The wine was excellent," I said. "Thank you for bringing it." He left without answering. I stood at the door for a moment after his car had gone, and the neighborhood was very quiet, the way suburbs get quiet on Saturday nights when everyone is inside, warm and domestic and unremarkable, and I felt the particular exhaustion that follows concentration, the kind of tiredness that is not unpleasant, that tells you the work is done. I closed the front door. Daniel was in the front hallway. I want to tell you this part carefully, because this is the part that matters, and it is the part I think about most when I think about that evening. He was standing about 10 feet from me, and he had that look again, the one from the kitchen, the one from Patricia's diagnosis. And I understood suddenly that he had been standing there listening for the entire conversation, and that he had heard his father dismantle Marcus Webb with the same methodical, documented, unemotional efficiency that his father had applied to everything in Daniel's life that required fixing, and that he was trying to figure out how to feel about it. "You knew the whole time," he said. "It wasn't an accusation, exactly. But it wasn't only an observation either." 3 weeks, I said. "You didn't tell me." "No." He was quiet for a moment. In the dining room I could hear the others' laughter, the sound of chairs, Diane's voice carrying over everyone else's, saying something that made the whole table laugh. The world continuing on the other side of the wall. "Were you worried I'd warn him?" Daniel asked. "No," I said. "I was worried you'd blame yourself. And I wasn't ready to have that conversation until I had everything in order, until you knew for certain that none of it was going to touch you or the company." I paused. That was probably wrong. I was managing it the way I manage cases, and you're not a case. You're my son. He looked at me. "I find it very difficult. I want to be honest about this. I find it very difficult to say the things that need saying in the moments that require them. I am 63 years old, and I have known this about myself for 30 years, and I have not solved it. Patricia used to help me. She would sometimes, in the middle of a conversation that was going sideways, simply take my hand and hold it for a moment, and that was enough to remind me that the words didn't have to be perfectly constructed, that they only had to be true. I didn't have her hand to hold, but I had her son standing in the hallway looking at me, and I thought, you don't have to get this right. You just have to mean it. I have not been easy to come to," I said, "for a long time. I know that. I think I've been a man who lost his partner and tried to keep functioning at the same standard. And the standard I maintained was a professional one, because that's what I know how to maintain. And you deserved a father, not a senior partner. I'm sorry for that. Daniel was quiet for long enough that I was certain I'd gotten it wrong after all. That it had come out like an argument rather than an apology. That 6 years of practiced emotional distance was not undoable in one sentence in a front hallway. Then he crossed the 10 feet and put his arms around me. He is my height, and his mother's build never quite as tall as he wanted to be, with her same quality of physical warmth, the kind that radiates without effort. I had not hugged my son properly since Patricia's funeral. I want to say that plainly because I think it needs to be said plainly. We had done the brief, shoulder pat versions. We had not stood in a hallway and held on. We held on for a while. He pulled back eventually and ran a hand across his face and said, with the particular rough humor he has always deployed when he is moved and doesn't want to show it, "You could have at least told me before the birthday dinner. I've had a terrible week." "You came to me on the day," I said. "You didn't come to me during the terrible week." He looked at me. "Old habits." "Yes," I said. "For both of us. We should work on that." From the dining room, one of his college friends appeared in the hallway doorway, looking confused. "Are you guys coming back? Is everything okay? We're about to sing." "We're coming," Daniel said. Marcus had to leave early. "Everything's fine," I said. We went back into the dining room. I lit the candles on the birthday cake, 45 of them, which is too many candles for a man of 45, but Daniel's friends had insisted, and someone dimmed the lights, and the whole table sang, badly and cheerfully, and at full volume, the way people sing when they are happy and not being watched. Daniel sat at the head of the table with candlelight catching his face and his mother's expression when she laughed, and I watched him from my end of the table, this person I had known for 45 years and somehow still managed to rediscover. He made a wish. He didn't say what it was. I didn't ask. After the cake and coffee, after the guests had gone and Daniel had helped me with the dishes with the comfortable, slightly companionable silence we had never quite managed to find before that night, he sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water while I dried my hands on a dish towel, and he said, "The Virginia property. Did he almost get it?" "He was about 2 weeks away from having the documentation in order," I said. "He needed one more signature. Mine. Was he going to forge it? Or persuade me to give it? He had a meeting scheduled. Did you know about that? He was going to suggest we have lunch, just the two of us, toward the end of the month." Daniel shook his head slowly. "He was very capable," I said, "and I meant it as a neutral assessment. You're not to blame for not seeing it. He was practiced and he was patient and he chose people whose trust he understood how to use. I brought him into everything," Daniel said. "He had access to the company's financials, the estate planning notes from last spring." "Daniel," he looked up, "you trusted a person who presented himself as trustworthy. That's not a flaw. That's just being a person. The people who don't trust anyone at all are worse off. Trust me. I've prosecuted them too." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom would have seen it." "In about 40 minutes, I agreed. He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. And for a moment my kitchen sounded the way kitchens are supposed to sound on Saturday evenings. "I'm going to need to restructure some things at the company," he said. "Diane's already started a full audit. It might get complicated." "I have time," I said. "And I know some people." He looked at me with an expression that was new, or maybe not new, but one I hadn't been positioned to see before. Something that was grateful and a little bit careful, and deciding to trust anyway. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I'd like that." He left around 11, and I walked him to his car the way I always used to when he was in his 20s and would come home for Sunday dinner. We stood on the driveway for a moment in the cold air, and he said he'd call me Monday, and I said I'd pick up, and he said quietly, with his hands in his jacket pockets, "Thanks, Dad." I told him to drive safe. I stood on the driveway until his taillights disappeared at the corner, the way I used to when he was 17 and had just gotten his license, and Patricia and I would stand on the porch long after the car was gone, pretending we weren't worried, both of us unable to go back inside quite yet. I went inside. I washed the last 2 glasses by hand. I put them in the cabinet where Patricia had always kept them. Before I went to bed, I opened the mahogany cabinet in my study and looked at the documents, everything back in its right place. Nothing taken, nothing altered. The deed, the trust. The Virginia property that my father bought before I was born on a hunch that turned out to be right, as his hunches usually were. I hadn't told Daniel this, but the timing of the highway interchange hadn't surprised me the way it surprised my accountant. My father had picked that land because he'd heard something at a county planning meeting 40 years ago, an early mention of a long-range infrastructure corridor that most people had immediately forgotten. He'd bought the land the following week and told no one. Patient men, the men in my family. We wait, we prepare. We sometimes wait so long we forget to say the things that matter while we're waiting. I was going to work on that. I closed the cabinet. I turned off the study light. On the shelf by the door, in a silver frame with a small chip on the lower right corner that I have never had repaired, there is a photograph from Daniel's college graduation, Patricia, in a yellow dress that she'd bought specifically for the day. Daniel in his cap and gown, my arm around both of them, all three of us laughing at something that one of Daniel's friends had just said, none of us looking at the camera. I have walked past that photograph 10,000 times in the last 6 years. I stopped and looked at it. Then I turned off the hall light and went to bed. And for the first time in a long time, I did not lie awake for an hour before I could sleep.